Howdy, everyone. I'm Emma Mormon, and I am the chair of the MSC Visual Arts Committee. And tonight we have with us Professor Benjamin Knox, who's going to give us a talk on color theory. Knox is a professional artist with over 30 years of experience under his belt. He's had focus in painting, drawing, and photography, and is best known locally for his collegiate art pieces that aim to capture the spirit of Aggieland. His impressive body of work and unfaltering positive spirit have helped him make quite the name for himself. He has been recognized nationally for his landscapes and spirited collegiate art and has won numerous awards, including Artist of the Year by the Arts Council of Brazos Valley. Professor Knox is also a former student who now teaches in the College of Architecture Visualization Department. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Mr. Benjamin Knox.
No, thank you. Without further ado. So what I'd like to cover is basically from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in the United States, there were two schools of color, two schools that taught color. And back then, everybody was into modern art movement and into, being expressive and so forth, and not really focusing on color. And so the two movements was Henry Hinchy, which comes from the Cape Cod school method, which goes back to William Merritt Chase. And his student, Camille Persuadic, was my mentor, one of my mentors. And so Camille, her approach to color is very much pushing, the vibrant colors. Instead of in the darks, putting your dark, blacks and so forth, finding, colors that could go in the darks, colors in the light, and finding color harmony there. And so Camille herself, as you can see, she has a very specific approach to focusing on color. I was with her actually when she painted this painting in California at the Mission. And so Camille is someone you definitely want to look up. She's got a fantastic approach. She still teaches today in California, and she does a lot of workshops. Great artist to work with. The other movement was with Sergei Bongart, and he came from Russia, in which he was a Russian impressionist. And so one of his students was Daniel Pinkham, and I studied with Daniel Pinkham, and his style is also, very focused on pushing color and color harmonies, things like that to create, evoke scenes. You can see how vibrant the color is. And they were kind of key. In 1962, Itten created the color contrasts, and the Munsell color system was developed, which basically you started with offset printing, and you started using color more accurately. So the color wheel, instead of it being complements of red and green, it now shifted to where the color wheel shifted, and you now had, let me grab it. You now had across from red, instead of green, you had blue-green. And across from yellow, you had purple-blue as complement. So Munsell color system helped develop the accurate way that we're seeing color, because when you have offset printing and lithography, you put the right colors on top of each other, and it creates the overall color scheme. So Stephen Quiller came out with a book called Color Choices. And Stephen, he lives up in Creede, Colorado. When I lived up in Lake City, which was an hour away, that's whenever I got to meet Stephen and hang out with him. And so I studied with him as well. And his concept is based on the Munsell color system. And it's the Creede, it's Stephen Quiller wheel, the Quiller wheel. And it's basically the Munsell system, but it's how it relates to watercolor, acrylic, oil, and so forth. So there's certain things about this that help to relate how you build your art piece and how you can create that. And so I would like to go over that because it's really a simple way to approach color. Something that seems pretty complex when in actuality can be simplified and can help. So I'm going to share the screen and pull up. You guys see the color theory? So there's three ways to choose a color. First, you have to name what hue it is, what family that it is. Then what direction on the color wheel that you need to go. Then you identify its relative value, how light or dark the color is. And then what intensity, how bright it is, the chroma. So say if I'm looking for, this color right up here, which is a yellow ochre. So I'm looking for a yellow ochre up here. So first I'd identify the hue and I'd say, well, it's either a yellow or an orange. Which one is it closer to? I'd probably say closer to an orange. And then I would say, okay, now what value is it? I would say it's a little bit lighter, maybe a little lighter in there. So I would lighten it. And then I would say, what is its intensity? If I add its complement on the other side, the ultramarine violet, I'll actually get it closer to that intensity and I'll get that color right there. And so the more that I can figure out where these are, if I want to find, say, a color that's here, then I would say, well, that's more in this, reading upside down, viridian. And then I would add a little bit of its complement and maybe a little bit of this blue to pull it down there. So it's like a dial. When you think of it like a dial, it makes it so much easier to find colors because you isolate the color and you think of that as like a dial. And that's what I do whenever I'm going through the different colors. So basically, you have your primaries, your red, yellow, and blue, which the Quiller wheel and the Munsell have shifted those a little bit based on the Munsell system. So cadmium lemon, more of a Algerian crimson, which needs to be a permanent. You got to be real careful with crimson if it's not a permanent. You can also use a quinacridone rose. So it's not truly red. That's the primary as the traditional. And then you have the phthalo blue as a primary. So those are your primaries. Then your secondaries are viridian, mauve, and cadmium scarlet. So you can see how on my slide here, I have your traditional primary colors of red, yellow, and blue, and that's what we all learn. But based on the RGBY and offset printing in today, the Munsell color system, this is more of an accurate way of mixing your colors. Although these are still yellow, red, and blue, it's a different color of those, and it helps to establish that. Then you can establish the secondary colors. And as Quiller will, the pie shapes are your primaries, the diamonds are the secondaries, and then you have your squares, to create your other ones too. Let's see, neutrals. Basically, your neutrals right in the middle, when you add the opposite, the complements of any color, eventually you're going to get that neutral color. And then you have hue, tint, tone, and shade. Hue is what family it is. Tint is if you lighten it. Tone is when you add tone, and shade is darken it. I'm going to move down a little faster due to time. Value and intensity. One thing I love to do is vibrating color. Now, in a lot of my paintings and so forth, I use a lot of semi-neutrals, which means a lot of earth tone colors, and because they're in nature. So if you look at this with John Lennon and with the glasses, it's very abstract and contemporary because the colors are very bold, chromatic. And so, it's not as realistic, but that's a matter of choice depending on if you're doing something graphic. So, you can see here how Kusama does very graphic contemporary art. It just explodes with color. It's high chroma, high intensity. So that's a key factor. So going through the different ways to look at color, value is one of the most important things. Value is what does most of the work, and then the color is what emphasizes that. So your lighter colors generally, as you can see on the value scale here, like your yellow, your orange, light green, they're lighter on the value scale. As you go to your blues, your ultramarines, and your violets, they get darker on the value scale. So that's something to keep in mind. As long as you hold your values, then you can put whatever color in there. So here's an example by Harley Brown. You can see the black and white image holds the structure very well. But when you look over to the left and the colors he's using, he chose a bunch of intense, crazy colors, but it's holding the value. So if you were to take the black and white picture of what's on the left, those are all in the lighter values behind and on the forehead, and then darker values for his shirt, his coat, with the purple and so forth, and in the shadows, the purples and all of that. But yet it holds really well because he's holding the values. And that's one thing you got to remember, is holding your value structure is key. Then you can put the color in there. You can also link your values. So by linking your values, you can design with that. So you can see, like with this ballerina, how her shoulder has lost and found edges that go into the background. And this also helps with edges, to choose what your hardest edge is and your soft edges are. As you can see along her shoulder, that edge is soft. It almost disappears. While the edge here between her leg and the background is a real hard, sharp edge. That's because it's a higher contrast in value. So if I put yellows and oranges and lighter value colors in the leg right here, and I put purples and blues in the background, you're naturally going to get a contrast, a stronger contrast. Same for here, these real light blues and oranges in the background, contrasting with his shoulder creates a definitive edge. I always look for the lightest light and the darkest dark. And that also helps with edges, where you have softer edges, harder edges, where the values relate. So here's the Quiller wheel. And you can see how the colors at the top are lighter in value, and as it goes down, they get darker in value here. So that relates to that as well. And it's based on the Munsell color system. So relationships are critical with the design, which is the values, how they relate to each other. These are real simple, monochromatic, using scarlet red and the other one using phthalo blue. And it's just monochromatic, using one color, pushing the values, with the shade darker, and then with tint, lightening, making lighter the values so that they relate. And you could see how those different shapes relate to each other. The background sky color is a lighter value as it is with the bus. So there's hardly any sort of edge there with the top of the bus compared to the sky in the background, because the value is so close. But as that goes into the front of the bus, you can see where the edge gets sharper because there's a higher contrast there. And so it helps to start off doing monochromatic to understand that. You can do a monochromatic dominant color with a touch of its complement. That's a real common thing that you see a lot too. For example, the Harley Brown here uses the monochromatic of the of the blue, ultramarine violet blue color. And it's pretty much a monochromatic, but there's touches of cadmium scarlet there by the eye, here creating a triad. And what that does, in the eyebrow, there's a little bit as well. What that does is that pulls it together, creates interest with that triad. And so it's choosing just a little bit of the complement with the monochromatic. So you can see in this War of the Worlds piece here, the fire is an orange yellow, which is a touch of the complement to the overall being like an ultramarine violet, dark purple color. So it really pushes that. So you can use complements even more to where you infuse, like here, cad scarlet and phthalo blue, sticking with the same theme, but now we have a little bit more of the blue and orange relating to each other and how that relates. This is actually in Creed, Colorado right here. And so you could see how that's watercolor and how he mixed the two. And when you mix the two complements, it gets a neutral gray in the middle. So that play between the pigment of the cad scarlet and the blue creates kind of a gray tone. And then when you put more pure chroma straight from the tube of like the cad scarlet and touch of yellow, he added a touch of yellow for the lights, it really pops, gives it a glow. So here's an example of neutral, more of a neutral gray. You know, when you're mixing the two complements, pretty much this whole piece has a neutral gray. And then choosing the ultramarine violet, ultramarine blue to really pop out. That emphasizes your focal point of the flowers there when everything else has that kind of a neutral gray effect. So it's a great way to do that too. So here's some complementary color schemes. This is Sergei Bongart, the bottom right, which you can see he's using the yellow, purple color schemes. Real common that he would really emphasize that in his portraits and get those effects. Sid Mead is a futurist at the top right who did Blade Runner. And you can see how he's using the complements of that real cool blue and real warm red. You know, the same phthalo blue and cad scarlet pushed over, dialed a little bit to the right, and you could see how that creates such vibrancy. And then Roger Dean to the left, he did a lot of album covers, still does, for Yes and a lot of different bands, stage sets and so forth. And he's just using orange and blue to create these just vibrating color. It just creates a real strong vibration, and putting those complements beside each other. So if you get three colors adjacent to each other, then you got an analogous color scheme. And so when you get the analogous color scheme, those three, you can also create some really interesting effects. Split complementary is whenever you, instead of the complement, you split it between the ones across. So for example, if I'm taking cad lemon at the top and its complement is mauve, instead of doing, I'm taking the two on each side. I'm taking permanent violet and ultramarine. I'm doing a split like so. And that's a split complement. All of these are great tools to use as, you know, with your tool belt whenever you're like painting and creating. So they all help. So here's an example of analogous color scheme, you know, using the three colors here. And then in the background, he's actually using a touch of the complement with the yellow, but you can see how that just creates a real harmonious feel. This is Stephen Quiller. Real harmonious feel here with those colors, and then adding its complement in the back. He does that a lot. So, you know, we often use a wide range of hues, semi-neutral colors and grays to capture richness of reality. So whenever we're doing landscapes, very seldom am I pulling out these real vibrant colors. Oftentimes I'm doing the semi-neutrals, which are the colors inside here. these are the colors I'm usually finding, so I have to mix yellow and green with a touch of its complement to get this color in here, and I'm mixing all these colors in here. And these are what Scott Christensen calls these are the grays, which are semi-neutrals basically. Scott's a landscape artist. He's one of the top in the world, and so these are all like the colors you find in nature, and generally harmonious colors that you find in nature live in this area inside here. You seldom see these really vibrant, bright colors unless it's like a rose and you find it on the rose or something, or cardinal, red cardinal. You can find it there, but you still got to like be careful that it lives harmonious in your painting and in that scene, because it can easily overpower the whole scene if you're not careful. Those bright colors, oftentimes man-made, like in this cable car is man-made, so it's bright red. So man-made objects will have bright colors and so forth. But if you look at this landscape over here, those are all semi-neutrals, mixing and blending the colors together using all of those factors. You can also create depth. As things go off into the distance, they get bluer. They lose the yellow and they start to get bluer, and they get more gray. Things get softer in general. So you can see how you can use that to affect color recession. Things in the distance usually recede, so that are bluer. And here's an example Stephen did where he has the flowers in the foreground that are yellow. Usually the yellows and reds come forward, the cooler colors recede. And so you can use that as your advantage, as he is here, in showing how things are receding and giving a system of depth. Another thing to remember is light. The color of light is so important. And cool light, which is generally what you have outside most of the time, like when it's a sunny day and you have cool light, creates warm shadows. Warm light creates cool shadows. And that's real important whenever you're doing portraiture. You can see on the left with the girl with the hat, she is in cool light, and so she has warm shadows. And that's generally the best way to capture a scene whenever you're doing light and shadow painting or drawing or painting, is thinking of that with the warmer shadows. Almost always you're going to have like real warm in the core of the shadows. Then on the guy on the right is cool light. I'm sorry, it's warm light. So he has cool shadows. They're almost blue. And see how that looks a little bit off, garish. And that's something you got to be careful now. Sometimes you'll put a warm light onto somebody and it will create cool shadows. Like a warm, hot firelight or something may create that. But that's something to look for. All of these are things that you look for that help to see that. So in 1962, Johannes Itten wrote a book called The Art of Color. And he came up with the 7 color contrasts. And these are really cool when you use these. I'm going to go over them real quick. One is contrast of view, which is basically just the family of color. Red is different from yellow, is different from blue. And that's because the values are different. And so you could see how even in this 500-year-old piece here, just by having the juxtaposition of contrast of view makes it stand out. Then you have light-dark contrast, which we talked about, the value, your lightest colors at the top of the value scale, and then how they get darker as they go down the value scale. Here's an example of light-dark contrast. You've got your light yellows against the contrast of, this is Rembrandt with the darks and the umbers and the purples and blacks, and just an excellent example of light-dark contrast. Then you have cold-warm contrast. Using Sid Mead's example again, even though it's often complementary too, but this real warm, fiery red ground plane and flag really holds that cool steel blue man-made structure, gives it just this real futuristic effect. I think he did that in the 60s or 70s, something like that. So, real interesting how he's able to use that. The hat above is an example of how some of the colors, like red, can be cool or warm. You can see the red to the left is much warmer than the red on the hat. The red on the hat is more of a crimson red, and so it's a cooler red. That's something to keep in mind, because even though that is a warm, cool contrast, it's still pretty cool against cool. And oftentimes on my palette, I do what I call a double complement palette. I use the warm and cool of the red, warm and cool of the blue, and warm and cool of the yellow on my palette. And so that way I can get that emphasis of different types of warm, cool contrasts. Then there's the complementary contrast, which, as we've talked about, like I've used orange and the blue consistently. Here is a green and red, and you could see how that is just vibrating. When you stare into that vibrating color, it just goes crazy. So that's a great way to compose as well, with your complementary contrast. Cezanne did that a lot. Here's one of my favorites: simultaneous contrast. One thing about color that's real important is that it's relative to what is around it. It's relative to the colors around it. And on my palette, I can have a green color, real green, and put it on my canvas. And when I put it on my canvas, it looks red. And I'm like, how in the world is that red on my canvas? And it's because all the colors around it are more green than the green that's on my palette. And it's real fascinating when you do that. So if you look at this, the two squares here and the X's, the X on the right looks pink and the X on the left looks more green. In actuality, the X is the exact same color. It just looks more pink because of what's around it. It's called a simultaneous contrast. And when you pull this off in a painting, it is so cool. It's really fun. If you look at the Rubik's Cube here, the yellow part in the top left and the blue part in the top right, if you look at those side by side, it's the exact same color. The reason why it looks yellow and blue is because the overall tint of the colors around it has been tinted blue or tinted yellow, but it's still the same color if you match them together. It's how it's contrasting to everything around it. So that square that's in the middle of the orange itself has kind of a bluish tint to it because it tends to want to be the complement of what you're looking at. So that square looks like it's more blue. In actuality, that's a gray square. It's neutral gray. If you were to wrap it around, red was wrapping around that square, it would look more green. So you can see how that makes an interesting effect. That's why this looks more pink in this X, is because that is a greener neutral gray behind it. So simultaneous contrast is a really fun way to do that. Contrast of saturation, it's basically how much chroma out of the tube. You can see the red in the middle there has a lot more chroma, and then as it goes out, it's less. You can add its complement, and that will tone it back, shade it, tint it. But usually, if you take paint right out of the tube, you get that high chroma. And so you can see in this painting here, it's almost a monochromatic painting, but the higher chroma is in the baby and in the red right here. So even here with Paul Klee, all of these fish and everything, this fish becomes a center of interest because it's higher chroma. It's a lot brighter, even in contemporary art, using that. And then contrastive extension. And that basically, where I showed you the lady that was all monochromatic, and then she had a little bit of red in her eyebrow and a little bit of red, around her eye and so forth. It's a little bit to a lot. And so this is just a little bit of color compared to a lot of color. And you can see how that can have a neat effect too. This is Bruegel. This was done 300 years ago. The elders fall of Icarus that flew too close to the sun and fell to earth. And I always thought this was interesting that even hundreds of years ago, they were thinking about color, because your eye goes to this guy's shirt. Everything in here is a green. It's a harmonious green. And so you've got this complement right here, a little bit to a lot, red. So your eye goes here, and it's like he's looking down and just minding his own business. Even the guy behind him is looking up. But if you look down here in the water, at the very bottom, you could see Icarus falling in the water. No one really cares. It's kind of a funny paradox. And it's interesting that he's thinking about color and a little bit of color to a lot. And so, that kind of creates an interesting effect with that. So I use these different approaches in my paintings to, to subtly say what I want to say. But a lot of times with my nature paintings and things like that, I stay within the semi-neutrals because I want them to, have a nature, harmonious, natural look and so forth. But occasionally I get more adventurous and do, do some brighter colors and things like that. It just depends on what I'm focusing on, what I'm doing. But hopefully those are helpful, tools and things to think about. And let me open it up for some questions. Emma?
Yes, we're going to go ahead and cycle through the exec team. We have some pre-prepared questions for you. Grace, do you want to go ahead and start us off?
Yeah, let me grab something. I have a bunch of paintings I'm just going to grab to show you. These are plein air, which I painted on location. You can see how here I'm using mainly harmonious natural colors to capture the scene accurately. While here I'm using a lot more orange as a harmonious color kind of mixed in with everything. And so I'm still using a lot of those semi-neutrals, but you can see there's a lot of orange and brighter colors that kind of pull that together. Kind of an anomalous color scheme, in there. And then I'm adding the ones on top. Here I'm trying to get the effect of sunset with the warms and then the cools down here, and then the warms again and the reflections. So, it's a beautiful scene and capturing that. I thought it'd be kind of fun to show. Okay, I'm open, Grace.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you for sharing those.
Sure.
Can you tell us more about your creative process?
And like just in terms of the creation, sure. Let me grab a couple of things. Here's what I'm working on now. This is a plein air painting that we did on location up near Chapel Hill. And this is a painting that I love the grove. I love the scene. You could see off into the distance. And I like how this almost looks like musical notes. You know, the trees, you got to look for variety. You know, you can't, they're all like spaced individually different and so forth. So this is a painting I did on location. And then I've been taking pictures of my parents' horses. And I've been wanting to do a painting with them in a setting with trees. And so using that same setting, you can see here's the painting with the horses. And so I have the plein air painting, and then I have my photographs that I've taken with the horses and so forth. And then I'm now in the process of going back and forth, trying to hold the shadow and the light, and that's my effect in this. And so, you know, there's still some work that needs to be done on it, but it's coming together. You know, it's pulling together. So that's an example there for you know, a larger landscape piece. For my pieces that I do, like say for A&M, let's take the 72-74 game where we played LSU and the game lasted for 5 hours. So for that, I was right there. And I've been shooting the games now for 25 years. And so I wish we had a lot more big wins like that. So, you know, in shooting the game and then coming up with conceptual sketches of how I wanted to create the piece, and then using a dynamic grid and laying it out, thinking about all the plays that made that such a great game. And then I created the painting for it. And that's, you know, that's the process of doing that. There's a lot of thought that goes in the initial concept, you know, of doing that. And I'm going to grab something else. I'll be right back. So here's a brand new one that I just finished, and it's very similar to this, to where I'm doing like a landscape and, you know, at the academic building. And I wanted to focus on the century tree, the academic building. You guys know how important the century tree is. And I thought, man, it'd be great to do a scene that's a panoramic that had the academic building and the century tree. And so I would go out and do, take photographs, do some little studies, you know, go out and paint on location, capture the scene, and then come out with, this is an actual print and the final product, you know, and then this is something I think that a lot of people will frame like with their diplomas and so forth. So that's what I was looking for, something that looked more stately and, you know, and kind of in my new style where I'm capturing all the essence of that. So is that helpful?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. What else?
Margaret, do you want to go next?
Okay, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sorry. My computer is being weird right now. So when you were talking about your reference pieces, can you talk a little bit about how you mix your paints to match the colors and how you measure your colors?
Mm-hmm. Let's see if might be easier just to show you. Let's see. All right. Here's my palette. think you can see. Actually, I haven't done this before, so you guys are getting a kind of a first. Pretty good idea to show the palette though, I think. So these are oils, and can you see it pretty good? So I have kind of like a Prismacolor. I have my white in the left, then I have my yellows, oranges, and reds. These are all my warm colors on the left side, and they go along like the way that they go on the Quiller wheel. They go up to my Alzarian Crimson. Then I have, which is a cool red. So this is the transition. And then I go into my blues. And then from my blues, cool blues, to greens. And then I have my earth colors. And then my semi-neutral colors over here. So say I'm looking for a specific color that I want to isolate. I can often use, this is you can look through this hole in my palette knife to isolate a color if there's a certain color I want. But say like, a challenging color is green. So say I mix with my palette knife, I get a little bit of blue, and then I mix a little bit of whichever yellow I want. And you can use a limited palette with just yellow, red, blue, and white, and accomplish almost any color that you want. And so let's say, okay, there's my green, but it needs to be warmer. So I add a little bit of red. Let's say there's that green there, perfect. And I say, and it needs to be a little bit lighter. So I add a little bit of white, and I mix that in. And then that gives me a color, say if I'm looking for this specific color. So, that helps me get that specific color if that's what I'm looking for. And I often use, there's different ways you can go about having a mother color that creates harmony or key or so forth. But that's how I basically dial in. So if I say, oh, something is more red, I'll pull from the red pile. And then I'll say, well, it needs to be a little bit more yellow. And then I look at what that yellow that I need to add to it, or it needs to be cool or it needs to be more blue. I'll add blue, to get that effect. And a lot of it is experience. The more you work with color, the more experience you get to where you can identify, oh, I need to just add viridian to that and it'll make it a cooler green, and that helps too. Another thing that helps is doing the color charts. Richard Schmid has a book called Alla Prima, Oil Painting, and he recommends basically mixing all of your colors together and then mixing 5 shades of white, or tinting it down white, so that you can see what those colors do. And I did all those color charts as well. Those I didn't put in the color theory exhibit, but they're just all different charts, basically, so you can identify what color and so forth. Is that helpful? Great.
Yes, thank you so much.
Hello. Could you tell us some more about your brushes and canvases that you use, especially for your oil paintings, but also for watercolor?
Yeah, so there's 2 different approaches. With watercolor, I like to use 300-pound hot pressed watercolor paper, Arches. It's 300 pound. You can do cold press. Cold press is great too. 300-pound cold press. But the key is that it has a lot of weight to it. And that's what I use for my watercolor. For painting, whenever I'm doing a larger piece like this, I like to use a linen, like different types of linen that's like double or triple primed. It can be acrylic primed or oil primed. But when you're just starting out, you can even buy the canvases at Hobby Lobby or Michael's that are Dick Blick or whatever that are already pre-stretched. Just make sure that you get them that are primed, you know, that they're double or triple primed with oil or acrylic, and then you just kind of feel what you want. But the canvas itself, you know, the texture of it, you'll find what you like. You just need to experiment. There's certain ones that I've tried that it's just too slick, and then there's some that, you know, like this guy I like a lot because it's just the right amount of tooth, but it's also holds the paint well. Now, for my plein air, I use panels, and there's different panels that you can get. The advantage of this is that you can carry them, and since it's oil and it's wet, I have a case that I put them in and carry them. It keeps them thin. They're solid. These I get from Raymar, and Raymar is a great company. They're a lot more expensive, but they're archival. They're some of the best panels in the world that you can get for doing oil paintings. But you can buy from Dick Blick. You can buy different ones and try them. There's really cheap ones too, and sometimes it's fun just to get those, just to do quick little paintings if you're not going to sell them. You know, but like this is an archival panel, and it's a Clausen's linen double primed oil panel, and so it, you know, it holds the paint really well. And so something too to go by, you know, when you're practicing and you're just starting off, you can just you know, experiment and see what works. But once you start to get more professional, you need to prepare at the highest level and practice at the highest level if you're going to paint at the highest level. So it's important to do that. And then brushes, I just have a wide array of different brushes that I use, and lots of just different ones. Utrecht, Signet, Robert Simmons, and I like to use I don't use flats as much. I like to use filberts, and you know, a lot of different ones. I use the palette knife, as I showed you. I use the palette knife a lot, but mainly with the brush, it's a matter of what does the job. You know, if I need a brush stroke that's this big and this wide, then that's what I'll use. You know, if I need something that's thinner, you know, I may use a flat like this that's thinner, you know, and then for detail and so forth, I'll use the thinner ones. So I've been enjoying these a lot. These are Hamburg Premier, and these are like for real fine detail in oil. And these are great, you know, great brushes. You know, again, you can get filberts or long flats, and you get like great effect with that. So, you know, try to use the best tool for the best, you know, whatever the brush stroke that you're doing. All right. I'll answer another question, and I've got to go make sure my little girl's in bed.
How does your use of color change across different media, like watercolor or oil or anything else?
You know, it's two different ways you go about it. Watercolor, you're thinking in reverse of oil. Watercolor, you're using the white of the paper to be the light area. And so when you're adding color to the paper, you're diffusing the chroma and the intensity by adding water. And you're applying that to the paper, and the more of the paper that comes through, the whiter it is. That's the beauty of watercolor in terms of creating a transparent feel to it, because it's a transparent medium. Oil is the opposite. Oil, you're putting on the darks first, and then you're adding the lights on top of that thicker and thicker, and you're adding white. Use a lot of white in oil. In watercolor, I don't use hardly any white. You know, I just let the white of the paper be transparent and come through. So color choices, you have to think in reverse. And, you know, I was accomplished in watercolor for 20 something years. And that's where, you know, I use that medium so much that when I started working in oil, I was so used to glazing that it was slowing me down. Even now, you know, I need to get better because a lot of these paintings, I'm glazing the way I would do with watercolor. And it's much better to think of it as a stroke of paint where I'm going to actually mix, you know, to get this white color, I'm going to mix a umber, a little bit of a violet, some yellow ochre, and a lot of white to get that kind of a gray sheen. And if I can hit that color spot on, then I'm real happy. Sometimes though, I tend to glaze. I'll put those colors and I'll glaze back and forth. And that goes back to my watercolor days where I would add those colors on and then I would be more transparent, letting the white come through. So it does have an effect, but I'm trying to get better at hitting it with one stroke, and that's a challenge. And some of these great artists like Sergei Bongard and, you know, these guys, the Russian Impressionists and so forth, they load up their brush with all those colors and just go, and there it is, and it's done, you know, and that's masterfully done. And I'm trying to get that, you know, accomplished as well with color in my oil, and it just takes time and practice, especially trying to unlearn the lessons that I've learned from teaching myself watercolor and glazing and so forth. I like that effect too, but you know, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, what your visual intent is, and so on the piece itself. But yeah, hopefully this has been helpful for everybody, and I appreciate your interest. I need to go by and see the exhibit, and I'm going to let my students know as well about the exhibit too. And I think I will wrap it up because I need to go.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. It's so inspiring to hear you talk about your work. It's obvious that you're so passionate about what you're doing, and we just so appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Good luck with you guys, and good luck with your art too. I know y'all love it, so stay passionate about it and have fun.